you should prepare yourself to deal with a new wave of inflation, because this time it might be made in the USA again. If President Joe Biden decides to officially sign off on sanctions against uranium from Russia, I guarantee that it will send massive shockwaves across the entire globe. Why would it be such a big deal if they actually go ahead and sign off on sanctioning uranium from Russia? It would seriously impact the whole world because it would definitely cause global turmoil. Let me explain. Uranium is the raw material used to generate energy in nuclear power plants, and Russia is the #1 supplier of uranium. If you look at this graph, you'll see that Russia supplies 24% of the uranium used in the United States. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, in order for America to secure this amount of uranium for nuclear power generation, they have to pay Russia up to $1 billion a year to guarantee a steady supply every year. But if they were to buy from sources other than Russia, the price of uranium would go up by as much as 20%. This means energy costs would have to go up by over 20% because if raw material prices increase by 20%, then energy will get even pricier. So if energy in the United States costs more, electricity bills will go up. Production costs would be even higher and inflation would be even worse. Right now, inflation in the United States is already at 3.5%, so it would get even more expensive. This would make it even harder for the Fed to lower interest rates, and if inflation keeps rising, the Fed might even have to raise interest rates. Those banks that collapsed last year, there were 3 of them, right? Like SVB, Silvergate, and there was another one whose name escapes me right now. They went under because of a major accounting deficit. The reason for that deficit was the value of their security balance, which means their supposedly safe and secure assets, like U.S. government bonds, dropped significantly. The value of those U.S. government bonds fell, and that's exactly why the banks found themselves in such serious financial trouble. When interest rates go up, yields go up too. If the Fed can't lower interest rates, bonds have to increase their yields as well. And every time new bonds come out with a yield that's 1% higher, the value or price of the older bonds drops by about 2 to 3%. So for U.S. banks that bought a lot of U.S. government bonds, the value of those bonds has dropped. So they end up with a balance sheet deficit. The most recent bank to fail was Republic Bank, which collapsed because it had a negative balance sheet of 45%. Okay, it wasn't just because of bonds. It could also be due to bad debt from commercial real estate, which has been crashing one after another. That's why the bank went under. That means if energy prices in the United States keep rising even more because of the ban on uranium from Russia, then inflation will have to go up. Interest rates will have to rise, and bond yields will also increase. This will cause even more banks to collapse one after another. And with inflation currently at 3.5%, it could go up to 4 or even 5%. This will make the world... Don't expect the Fed to be able to cut interest rates anytime soon. The ones who will have to bear the burden are the companies, who will have to shoulder the higher interest rates, which means more debt. And we might see not just banks, but also American companies collapsing left and right, basically going bankrupt. Okay, oil is expensive, and the money that has to be sent to support the war still needs to be sent, and in large amounts too. Most recently, $61 billion was sent, and before that, $100 billion was sent. That's a huge amount, and OPEC still hasn't finished cutting oil production yet. There's another round of cuts coming this June, which will push global oil prices even higher. Inflation is just going to keep rising, and if the United States goes ahead and bans uranium from Russia to drive up domestic nuclear energy prices even more, well, inflation will be skyrocketing all the way to Mars. Okay, so if inflation gets this bad, it's not just going to be tough for banks or companies. It's definitely going to hit households hard too. Because right now, the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, is also rising, right? Since 2021, electricity bills in the US have already gone up by 27.1%, and food prices have increased by 20.8%. So the CPI has risen by 16.05%. And if they keep cutting off energy from Russia, they've already cut off fossil fuels, right? If they go ahead and cut off uranium too, the cost of living is gonna get even worse. Okay, next question. Let's take a look at just how important uranium is to the United States. We really need to see how crucial nuclear energy is for the US, right? So here are some numbers for you. When it comes to electricity in the United States, what sources does it come from? Number one is fossil fuels, things like gas and oil, which make up 60% of the country's electricity, or 2.5 trillion kilowatt hours. Second is renewable energy, which totals 894 billion kilowatt hours, accounting for 21.4% of the country's electricity. As for nuclear, it's 775 billion kilowatt hours. That's 18.6% of the country's electricity. So, okay, it seems manageable because uranium from Russia only makes up 24% of the raw materials used for nuclear production in the entire United States, right? And nuclear energy itself only accounts for 18.6%. So 20% from Russia is just a quarter of 18.6% of the energy used in the United States, right? Oh, so it's not really a big deal then, just a small part, but it's not used like that. You can't really compare it that way. You know why? Because according to data from the EIA, the energy produced by nuclear plants actually has a capacity or the potential to supply electricity that's much higher than what comes from fossil fuels, up to 8,000 times. That means nuclear has a much, much higher capacity to supply electricity than other energy sources. So when you look at it, nuclear energy, just look at this chart. Nuclear provides as much as 92.5% of electricity. That's a lot. Off topic for a second, look at this chart. See the ones at the bottom? The energy sources that don't produce very well, what are they? They're solar and wind, which don't really have much capacity to supply electricity. But the US loves to promote these to developing countries and hype them up. All right, let's take a look at what the US has already banned or sanctioned from Russia. Of course, there's oil, aluminum, copper, and nickel, basically all sorts of metals and such. So if the US were to sanction Russia completely, telling every country not to buy anything at all from Russia, would that really hurt Russia? Would it be enough to bring them down? Not really. If you look at Russia's actual numbers, they haven't really been hurt, and they haven't gotten any poorer. Take when Russia was sanctioned on oil, for example. Europe joined in on the sanctions too, but the ones who really suffered weren't the Russians, it was Europe. The group of 7, like the Avengers, took the hit for the United States. And by the way, the US isn't planning to ban uranium from Russia today. They're planning that if this law passes, they'll ban uranium from Russia starting around 2028, which is about 3.5 years from now. The law will have an enforcement rule that kicks in 90 days after it's officially approved. So that means 90 days after January, which means that's actually a good thing, right? It gives the United States, or really the US itself, time to prepare. For example, some states like Illinois get up to 50% of their energy from nuclear power, so they'll need to figure out what they can substitute or how they can source uranium from somewhere else. Or maybe it gives Russia time to prepare too, since the $1 billion a year they get from the US for uranium will be gone. But no, that's not how it is. Because with Russia, look at this. There are rumors saying that if President Joe Biden signs off on sanctions against Russian uranium, Russia has already said they'll strike back immediately. No need to wait 3.5 years. I won't send it to you today. Basically, Russia is saying, you don't even need to bother passing a sanctions law. I just won't send it myself. So let's keep going. If the EU, the European Union, joins in sanctioning uranium from Russia, what would the situation look like? First, let's ask, who would be hit the hardest? Who would be the first to go down? I'll tell you right now, the first country in the EU to be in trouble would be France, because France gets up to 70% of its energy from nuclear power plants. Across the entire EU region, they import uranium from Russia at about 19.7% per year. Let's just round it up to 20%. And ever since the EU had to cut off oil and gas from Russia, they've been scrambling. They had to buy more uranium from Russia instead. No wonder Russia never goes broke. If they can't export oil and gas, they just export uranium. That's why Europe has had to buy even more uranium from Russia than before the war in Ukraine started. Wait a minute, the increase is up to 80%. That's basically doubling the amount of money spent. And if they end up banning uranium from Russia too, who knows what will happen? Europe will probably have to use even more expensive energy sources. So let's just play a little hypothetical game here. Let's suppose if the US and Europe join forces to sanction uranium from Russia, where will the uranium go? TikTok? Who will get it? I don't know, and I'm not saying it'll be Thailand. Does anyone else think like me? It's definitely going to China, right? Besides the good relationship between China and Russia, if Russia wants to sell uranium to China, it's super easy. They can just offer it at an even lower price. Lowering the price even more for China means that China will be able to produce goods at an even cheaper cost. China has nuclear plants, China has nuclear power plants. If Xi Jinping sees this news, he'll be smiling in his sleep. He doesn't have to do anything, and he might end up getting even cheaper energy than before. Right now, just China alone has been stockpiling uranium for like decades, over the past 10 years or so. They have enough uranium to generate nuclear power for the entire country of China for another 10 years. And if they keep getting cheap uranium from Russia on top of that, honestly, I think China really can't get electricity prices any lower than they are. If China manages to lower their electricity costs even more, they'll produce goods at even cheaper prices. Right now, Chinese products are already flooding everywhere. In Thailand, we're feeling the impact, with people saying goods are pouring in because no one can compete with China's production costs. Unless China gets even more advantages. China already gets cheap oil from Russia, and on top of that, Russia's giving them discounts. China's electricity prices are already super low. Now look at our electricity bills. They just keep going up and up and up. Our production costs, our cost of living, everything is just getting more expensive, right? So if the US bans uranium from Russia, the US will have to deal with higher electricity prices. If electricity gets more expensive in the US, inflation there will go up, and then the Fed will have to raise interest rates. If the Fed raises interest rates, that means other countries will also raise their interest rates too, so that the interest rate gap doesn't get too wide and capital doesn't flow out. But when interest rates go up, all sorts of companies will have to shoulder higher debt burdens from the increased interest. That's going to hurt the economy. So debt is not something we can just ignore. It's something we really need to keep an eye on. If you ever hear news that President Joe Biden has signed off on sanctions against Russian uranium, then, my friends, it's going to be big news all around the world. Seriously. So don't just scroll past after watching. Hit that subscribe button for us first. Thank you.